The unexpected revelation. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Judge Thomas Alcott sat at the bench, his mind focused on the proceedings before him. The case of Morgan Financial had drawn public attention, and Thomas was determined to make a fair and just decision. The prosecution was relentless, detailing how the defendants had used deceptive practices to mislead investors, and Thomas meticulously jotted down his notes, unaware that his world was about to change forever. It was late afternoon, the sun's golden rays streaming through the high windows of the courtroom, casting long shadows on the polished wooden floors. The murmur of voices from the gallery softened as the prosecutor's voice grew louder, but Thomas's thoughts remained fixed on the case. He was a seasoned judge, calm, composed, and unaffected by the drama around him. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, pausing for effect, "the evidence clearly shows that the defendants intentionally misled their investors. They need to be held accountable for their actions." The words seemed to echo in the room, but Thomas remained unshaken. He glanced at his watch. 4:30 p.m. The time when he would typically ask for the defense's rebuttal. However, before he could utter a word, something completely unexpected happened. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom slammed open with a force that made everyone jump. Gasps echoed throughout the room as a young voice rang out, clear and piercing. "You've lied long enough." The words cut through the air like a sharp knife. "I'm your son." All eyes turned to the source of the voice, a young black boy, no older than 15, standing boldly in the center of the courtroom. His dark skin glistened under the sunlight, and his eyes, wide and filled with fire, were locked on Judge Alcott. His clothes, a rumpled navy blue school uniform, were disheveled, but his presence was undeniable. He had stormed into the courtroom, and now he stood before them, a figure of undeniable determination. The room fell into stunned silence. A collective intake of breath filled the air as the boy's words reverberated through the walls. The boy's voice rang out again, louder and more forceful this time. "I'm your son." The crowd's reaction was immediate. Whispers cascaded through the gallery like a tidal wave, and reporters frantically scribbled in their notepads, trying to capture the unfolding scene. But for Thomas, time seemed to stand still. His eyes fixed on the boy, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. The boy's words echoed in his mind, his gaze locked onto the teenager's intense stare. The room felt suffocating. The boy's declaration had hit Thomas like a lightning bolt, a jolt that sent him back to a time he had long tried to forget. His past, a dark and painful chapter, resurfaced in an instant. The boy standing before him wasn't just some stranger. It was a reminder of his own past, a connection he hadn't expected. His chest tightened as memories flooded his mind. Thomas's blue eyes, usually cold and calculating, were now wide with disbelief. The boy's words had dredged up a flood of memories, memories of a time when he was a child, abandoned by his own father in this very courtroom. The scars of that abandonment had shaped him into the man he was today. But now, standing before him, was the living embodiment of something he thought he had buried long ago. The boy's gaze never wavered as he continued to stare at the judge. "You don't remember me, do you?" he asked, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. The words cut through the tension like a blade. Judge Alcott, his hands now gripping the edge of the bench, struggled to find his voice. The courtroom remained silent, each person waiting for his response. Thomas could feel the weight of the boy's gaze, and for the first time in years, he was unable to maintain his composure. His mind raced, and confusion set in. Who was this boy? How could he know something so personal? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his own voice, shaky, almost imperceptible. "What are you talking about?" he asked, barely able to comprehend the situation unfolding before him. The boy took a step forward, his expression hardening with resolve. "You don't remember, but I do," he said. "You left me, just like your father left you." The words struck Thomas like a blow to the stomach. He blinked, unable to process what the boy had just said. Left him. left him like his father had left him. "Who are you?" Thomas finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse. "I'm Elijah," the boy replied. "Elijah Alcott." A chill ran down Thomas's spine. The name, his own name, spoken by the boy with such certainty, made his heart race. How could this be? Was this possible? The boy's face, so much like his own, was like a mirror to a past Thomas had buried deep inside. The resemblance was undeniable. The boy's words cut through the air again, this time with the force of a storm. "You're my father, Judge Thomas Alcott." The courtroom erupted into chaos. People stood, murmuring in disbelief, some unsure of what they had just heard. The weight of Elijah's claim hung heavy in the air. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest, and his world tilted on its axis. How could this be? He had no memory of this child, no recollection of ever having a son. Elijah's words seemed to crack through the walls Thomas had built around himself, the walls that had protected him for so long, protecting him from the memories of his own father's abandonment, from the pain of being a child without a family. And now, here was Elijah, standing before him, claiming to be his son. Thomas felt a wave of emotions flood over him: shock, confusion, anger, and something he hadn't expected: guilt. I don't know what you're talking about," Thomas stammered, his mind scrambling for answers. "I never had a child. You must be mistaken." But Elijah shook his head, his eyes not leaving the judge. "You can deny it all you want, but the truth will come out, Judge Alcott. You can't hide from who you are." Thomas was speechless, his mind racing to make sense of the revelation. Could it be true? Could this boy really be his son? The room felt like it was closing in on him, and for the first time in his life, Judge Thomas Alcott didn't know what to do. The weight of the past. The silence in the courtroom hung heavily in the air, thick with the unspoken words between them. Thomas could hear his heart pounding in his chest, a rhythmic drumbeat that seemed to echo through the vast chamber. His hands, which had always been steady and confident, now trembled slightly as they gripped the edges of the bench. Elijah's presence, so resolute and filled with purpose, felt like an undeniable force, one that Thomas couldn't escape, no matter how hard he tried. The murmurs of disbelief from the gallery had ceased, and the once bustling courtroom had become a void. The only sound was the soft shuffle of Elijah's shoes on the polished wood floor as he stood before Thomas, waiting for him to respond, to make sense of the truth that had just been laid before him. For a long moment, Thomas said nothing. His mind was spinning, his thoughts colliding with one another, each one more fragmented than the last. This was impossible, wasn't it? How could this boy, this teenager, be his son? The idea seemed absurd, yet it felt painfully real. Every fiber of his being screamed for an explanation, but none came. He had no memory of the boy, no recollection of any such connection. But Elijah's eyes, those deep, knowing eyes, were the eyes of a child who had seen too much, a child who had suffered in ways Thomas could never have imagined. Elijah, sensing that Thomas was lost in his own thoughts, took a step back, his gaze softening just slightly. He didn't want to push too hard. Not yet. He knew that the man sitting before him was struggling with something far greater than the shock of the revelation. He was facing a past he had buried, a past that had shaped him into the person he was today. "You don't have to say anything right now," Elijah said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "I know it's a lot to process, but I'm not going anywhere. I've spent years searching for you, and I'll keep looking until I get the answers I need." Thomas swallowed hard, his throat tight. He couldn't speak, couldn't formulate the right words. He had spent decades building a life of control and precision, of order in the face of chaos. He had worked tirelessly to distance himself from the pain of his childhood, pain that had once driven him to become the person he was, a man who, despite his success, had never been able to escape the scars of abandonment. Now, faced with the reality that he had a son, this son, Elijah, he felt as though the very foundations of his life were crumbling beneath him. How could he have abandoned his own flesh and blood? How could he have let his past mistakes define the choices he made, leading him to this moment of complete uncertainty? The truth was, Thomas had always been afraid of becoming like his father, the man who had abandoned him without a second thought, leaving him alone in a world that felt unforgiving and cold. He had vowed to never make the same mistakes, to never subject anyone to the same loneliness and betrayal he had suffered as a child. But now, standing in front of him, was the living embodiment of his greatest fear, a child who had lived without him, without the father he never knew he had. "I never meant for this to happen," Thomas finally managed to say, his voice hoarse with emotion. He looked at Elijah, but his gaze faltered as his mind flashed back to his own childhood. He saw the boy he once was, alone, abandoned, and forgotten. The memory of his father's departure, the coldness that had settled in his heart, threatened to overwhelm him. "I never wanted to leave you," Thomas continued, his voice barely audible. "But I didn't know how to be the man I was supposed to be. I didn't know how to face the things that happened to me." Elijah listened quietly, his expression unreadable. He could see the pain in Thomas's eyes, the deep-seated guilt and shame that had festered for years. But he also saw something else, something that made him hold on to a thread of hope. The vulnerability in Thomas's voice, the crack in his armor, told Elijah that there was more to this man than the cold, calculating judge he had been raised to believe in. "It's okay," Elijah said, his voice steady but gentle. "I'm not here to blame you. I'm here to understand. I spent years feeling the hole where a father should have been, but now I'm trying to find the man who can fill it. Not to replace the years we lost, but to make sense of it all. I need to know the truth, Judge Alcott, and I need you to face it." Thomas's chest tightened, and for the first time, he found it impossible to hold back the tears that had been threatening to spill over. He closed his eyes, struggling to maintain the facade of control that had always been his shield, the facade that had kept him from confronting the past, from confronting the man he had been before he became the judge he was today. The memories flooded back like a torrent, memories of a younger Thomas Alcott, standing in the same courtroom where Elijah now stood, a child abandoned by his own father. Thomas's father, a man whose coldness had been a shadow in his life, had walked away without a backward glance, no apology, no explanation, just a disappearance that had shattered Thomas's world. It had taken him years to rebuild, to claw his way out of the darkness and into the light. But in the process, he had buried everything: his emotions, his fears, his regrets, underneath layers of professional success and authority. But now, in the face of this boy, this stranger who claimed to be his son, all of that seemed to unravel. "I wasn't ready to be a father," Thomas said, his voice thick with regret. "I wasn't ready to be him, to be the man who takes responsibility, the man who shows up when he's needed." Elijah nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. He had heard the pain in Thomas's voice, and for a brief moment, a flicker of understanding passed between them. Elijah had been a child when his mother had told him about his father, the man who had left them. He had heard the stories, the hurt, and the anger. He had grown up with the weight of abandonment on his shoulders, wondering what had gone wrong. He had longed for answers, for some kind of explanation that would make sense of the shattered pieces of his life. And now, standing before him, was the man who could give him those answers. Or not. "I don't expect you to have all the answers, Judge," Elijah said softly, his tone steady but compassionate. "But I do expect you to try, to face me, to face what you did, and what you can still do." The words lingered in the air, heavy with the gravity of the situation. The room felt small, suffocating, as though the weight of the past had settled on Thomas's shoulders, pressing him down, making it hard to breathe. He wanted to deny it, wanted to walk away, to close the door on this chapter of his life. But something in Elijah's eyes, something raw and unyielding, refused to let him. Thomas took a deep breath, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. He knew that he couldn't run from this any longer. The truth was out there, and it had come for him, standing in the form of the very child he had once abandoned. "I don't know where to begin," Thomas admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'll try. I'll try to understand everything." Elijah nodded again, a flicker of hope sparking in his eyes. "That's all I ask. Just try." The weight of the words settled on Thomas's heart like a heavy stone. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with painful revelations and uncomfortable truths. But for the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of something he had long buried, something that had been lost, but might just be found again. The unraveling truth. Days passed after the dramatic scene in the courtroom, but the echoes of that moment still lingered in Thomas Alcott's mind. Every waking hour seemed like a blur of memories and fleeting thoughts, each one taunting him with questions that he had no answers for. His life, once so meticulously ordered and controlled, had been shattered by the appearance of a boy who claimed to be his son. The weight of Elijah's words, the assertion that Thomas had abandoned him, that he had been searching for him for years, stuck with him, refusing to let go. It felt as though his very identity had been placed under a microscope, and for the first time in his life, Thomas was unsure of who he truly was. Sitting in his office, surrounded by piles of case files and the cold steel of his legal world, Thomas tried to focus on his work, but his mind kept drifting back to Elijah. He couldn't help but wonder how this boy had lived, what his life had been like without a father. What kind of person had Elijah grown into? What had it been like for him to grow up with only the fragmented stories of a man who had never been there? The days were filled with questions, but there were no answers. And the nights, those long, sleepless nights, were spent tossing and turning in his bed, haunted by dreams of a child he didn't remember. Dreams that were a strange mixture of nostalgia and dread, filled with fleeting images of a past that seemed both foreign and familiar at once. Elijah had asked him for time to process the truth, time to come to terms with what had been lost. And though Thomas had agreed to it, he knew that time was not going to heal the wounds that had been opened. There were too many pieces missing from this puzzle, too many gaps in the story for him to simply move forward and pretend like nothing had changed. The following week, Thomas arranged to meet Elijah in a private office, away from the prying eyes of the courtroom. It was a decision that weighed heavily on him. For the first time, he found himself questioning everything. The life he had built, the choices he had made, the very man he had become. When Elijah walked into the room, he was dressed simply, a faded jacket and a pair of well-worn jeans. His face was solemn, yet there was a strength in his posture, a quiet determination that made it impossible for Thomas to look away. "Judge Alcott," Elijah said, his voice steady, though there was a hint of uncertainty beneath the surface. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I know this isn't easy, but I think we need to talk about everything. About what happened, and what comes next." Thomas nodded, unable to find words at first. The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. Elijah seemed to understand, though, and he sat down across from Thomas without hesitation, his gaze never leaving the older man's face. "I don't know where to begin," Thomas finally said, his voice tight with emotion. "I don't know if I can make sense of all of this, Elijah. I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know how I could have let you down, how I could have left you." Elijah's expression softened, but his eyes remained firm. "It's not about making sense of everything right away. I didn't come here expecting you to have all the answers. I came because I need to understand who I am. I need to know why you weren't there, why you walked away. And I need to know if there's any chance that you can be a part of my life now." The rawness of Elijah's words hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. Here was a boy who had been through so much, someone who had been abandoned, rejected, and left to fend for himself in a world that had been less than kind. And despite all of that, despite the years of absence, Elijah was willing to open the door to the possibility of a relationship with the very man who had abandoned him. "I don't know if I can be what you want me to be," Thomas said, his voice wavering. I don't know if I can be the father you need me to be. I've spent my whole life. I've spent my whole life building a wall around myself. I didn't know how to be a father. And now, I'm afraid I might be too late." Elijah leaned forward, his gaze steady but soft. "I'm not asking you to fix everything. I'm not asking you to make up for the years we lost. I'm just asking for honesty. I'm asking for you to face what you did, to face me. I need you to show me that I'm not just a mistake to you, that I'm not something you can just walk away from again." Thomas's heart tightened at the vulnerability in Elijah's voice. He could see the pain in the boy's eyes, the years of hurt that had been buried deep within him. But he could also see the flicker of hope, hope that Thomas could never have imagined. "I wish I could go back," Thomas whispered. "I wish I could undo everything. But I can't. I can't undo the years of silence, the years of not being there for you." Elijah nodded, his expression still resolute. "I know, and I don't expect you to. But what I do expect is that you don't run away from this anymore. You don't get to ignore me like you did all those years ago. I'm not a ghost, Judge. I'm your son, and I'm here." The words hung in the air like a weight, and Thomas couldn't help but feel the immense gravity of the truth that Elijah had just spoken. He wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a forgotten memory. Elijah was real, and he had been real all along. The silence that followed felt suffocating, and Thomas struggled to find the right words to break the tension. He had spent his whole life pretending to be someone he wasn't, someone strong, someone in control. But in this moment, sitting in front of the son he never knew he had, he felt smaller than he ever had before. "I can't promise you that I'll be the father you've always wanted," Thomas said, his voice hoarse. "But I can promise you this. I will try. I will try to be there for you in whatever way I can." Elijah looked at him, his expression softening, and for the first time, there was a glimmer of something else in his eyes. Trust. It was a fragile trust, one that had been built on the hope that Thomas would not turn his back on him again. "I don't need perfection, Judge," Elijah replied. "I don't need you to be some ideal father. I just need you to be real. I need you to be honest with me. That's all." Thomas exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest seeming to lift ever so slightly. For the first time since Elijah had walked into his life, he felt the possibility of something different. A chance for redemption. A chance to rebuild what had been broken. "I'll be real with you, Elijah," Thomas said, his voice steady. "And I'll try. I can't undo the past, but I can try to make a future. For both of us." The words weren't a promise of an easy path, but they were a promise of effort, a promise that Thomas would no longer run from the truth, no longer hide behind the walls he had built to protect himself. Elijah smiled, a small but genuine smile, and for the first time, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward, a way to reconnect, to build something new, despite the brokenness of the past. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't filled with tension or uncertainty. Instead, it felt like a beginning to a story that neither of them could have predicted, but one that they were both ready to write together. "You said, bridging the gaps." The days that followed the meeting between Thomas and Elijah were filled with reflection, but also with an underlying sense of change. There was a quiet tension in the air, as if both men were testing the waters, unsure of how to navigate the complexities of their new reality. The courtroom remained a place of business for Thomas, but it no longer felt like home. The weight of his role, the walls he had so carefully built around himself, seemed to crumble a little more with each passing day. Thomas continued to go through the motions of his work, but his thoughts often drifted back to Elijah. What had his life been like? What had he endured in all these years? How could he possibly make up for the time they had lost? These questions gnawed at him, tugging at his conscience with a relentless persistence. It had been a week since their conversation in the office. Thomas had sent Elijah a text, an invitation to meet again. This time, he wanted to hear more about Elijah's life, about what had brought him to this point, about the boy who had stood before him, demanding answers. Elijah had agreed, though he hadn't given any indication of what he hoped to gain from the meeting. Thomas had to admit, neither did he. But one thing was certain, he couldn't leave things unfinished. He needed to understand Elijah. And more than that, he needed to understand himself. When they met, this time in a small cafe near the courthouse, the atmosphere was lighter, though the heaviness of their previous conversation still lingered like a quiet shadow. Elijah was already seated when Thomas arrived, his face a mixture of calm and something else, an emotion that Thomas couldn't quite place. Elijah looked up as Thomas approached, giving him a small nod, and Thomas sat down opposite him, the air between them thick with anticipation. "I've been thinking a lot," Thomas began, his voice tentative. "About you. About everything. And I want to hear your story. All of it. I want to understand what you've been through, what your life has been like." Elijah smiled faintly, but there was no bitterness in his expression, only an understanding that the past couldn't be changed, only carried forward. "I've had my share of struggles, Judge. But I also had moments of peace. I guess that's all any of us can hope for, right?" Thomas nodded, listening intently. He had no idea what Elijah was about to say, but he knew one thing for certain. This was the beginning of something bigger than either of them had anticipated. The words exchanged in their last meeting were merely the first step toward a much larger journey, a journey neither of them could have prepared for. Elijah leaned back in his seat, taking a deep breath before beginning. "I don't know if you've ever thought about what it's like to grow up without a father, but I can tell you that it's not easy. Not when you're the one asking why you're different from the other kids, why your mom has to work 2 jobs just to keep you in school, why there's always an empty seat at the dinner table." Thomas felt the weight of Elijah's words like a physical blow. The world outside the cafe seemed to fade away as Elijah's story unfolded before him. It wasn't just a recounting of facts. It was the telling of a life, a young man's life, shaped by the absence of a father who had never even thought to look back. "I don't remember much from when I was little," Elijah continued, his voice calm but distant, as if the act of remembering took him to a place he wasn't ready to visit. "I was too young to understand why you weren't around. But as I got older, the questions started coming. I started wondering who you were, what happened to you. I asked my mom, but she didn't have answers. She never talked about you much. I think it hurt her too much. So I just kept searching, hoping one day I'd find something that would explain everything." Thomas swallowed hard, guilt gnawing at his insides. He had never allowed himself to truly imagine what it must have been like for Elijah, to live in that constant state of longing and confusion, never knowing why his father had chosen to leave. He had been too focused on his own pain, his own abandonment, to consider the effects it had on the child he had left behind. "I'm sorry," Thomas said quietly, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for everything. I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't mean to leave you like that." Elijah met his gaze, his expression softening but not changing. "I know you didn't mean to. I know it wasn't your plan. But it happened. And I had to live with it. I had to learn how to live without the person who was supposed to protect me, teach me, love me." The silence that followed was thick, heavy with unspoken words and unhealed wounds. Thomas could feel the weight of his past pressing down on him, but it was different now. It wasn't just about his own mistakes anymore. It was about the life Elijah had lived, the life he was trying to build despite the absence of the father he deserved. "So, what did you do?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did you get through it all?" Elijah looked down at his hands, his fingers tapping softly on the table as if he were searching for the right words. "I learned how to survive. I learned how to keep my head above water, even when I was drowning. I kept going, kept pushing forward. I had to. There wasn't anyone else to do it for me." The words were simple, but they held so much meaning. Elijah's resilience was clear in the way he spoke. He wasn't someone who had given in to the weight of his circumstances. He was someone who had fought, who had found a way to keep moving, even when it seemed like there was no reason to. Thomas could feel a lump in his throat, a mixture of pride and sorrow rising within him. He had no idea what Elijah had gone through, but hearing it now, he realized just how much strength it had taken for Elijah to come this far. "I can't fix everything," Thomas said, his voice cracking slightly. "I can't make up for the time we lost. But I want to be here for you. I want to know you, Elijah. I want to try to make things right, however long it takes." Elijah nodded, the faintest smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I'm not asking for a perfect father, Judge. I don't need someone to make everything right. I just need someone who will show up. Someone who will keep showing up, even when it's hard." Thomas felt a sense of relief wash over him, but it was mixed with something else, something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. He could still build something from the ashes of the past, something real. Maybe not a perfect relationship, but a real one. A relationship built on truth, effort, and vulnerability. For the first time, Thomas saw Elijah not as a symbol of his past mistakes, but as a person. A young man who had grown into someone remarkable despite the cards he had been dealt. And he knew, in that moment, that he wanted to be a part of Elijah's life. Not just as a judge, not just as the man who had abandoned him, but as a father. The conversation shifted as they continued to talk, slowly weaving their stories together, filling the gaps with understanding and a willingness to move forward. There was no grand revelation, no sudden reconciliation. But there was something more important, the acknowledgement that both of them were willing to take the next step together. And that Thomas realized was where the real healing began, not in erasing the past, but in accepting it, and in the courage to move forward, one step at a time. The test of time. The weeks that followed the conversation at the cafe were a whirlwind of emotions and gradual changes. Thomas and Elijah's relationship began to evolve, not quickly or dramatically, but in small, meaningful ways. There were no grand gestures, no immediate declarations of father and son, but there was something far more significant, an unspoken understanding that both of them were navigating new territory, with no map to guide them. For Thomas, the shift was subtle at first. It started with little moments, casual text messages, a few phone calls, and the occasional coffee together. It wasn't perfect, and the awkwardness was always there, lingering in the background like a shadow, but it was progress. For the first time in his life, Thomas felt a genuine connection to someone outside of the courtroom. He found himself thinking about Elijah more often than he had expected, wondering what he was doing, how he was feeling, whether he was really ready for this journey. Thomas spent his nights reflecting on his own fatherless upbringing, but with a new perspective. His own memories were no longer just a painful reminder of abandonment, but a source of empathy. He now understood what it meant to grow up without the steady presence of a father figure. He understood the ache of unanswered questions, the lingering feeling of being less than whole because something or someone was missing. Elijah, on the other hand, seemed to accept the slow pace with grace. He wasn't pushing for immediate results, wasn't asking for everything all at once. He was patient, but his patience was not passive. It was an active waiting, a silent testing of Thomas's willingness to stay present. It wasn't easy for either of them, and there were times when the weight of unspoken words made their interactions feel heavy, but they kept moving forward, one small step at a time. The first breakthrough came on a late Saturday afternoon when Thomas invited Elijah to attend a charity event he was hosting. It wasn't a grand affair, just a small gathering of people Thomas knew from his professional world. There would be speeches, a silent auction, and a few moments of mingling. For Thomas, it was an opportunity to show Elijah that he was a part of his life, even if the foundation wasn't yet strong enough for public declarations. For Elijah, it was a test of how much he trusted this fragile new relationship. When Elijah walked into the venue with Thomas, he felt the weight of all the eyes that turned toward them. The tension in the air was palpable, and for a moment, Elijah felt the familiar sting of being out of place. He wasn't a part of this world, not yet. He didn't belong to Thomas's polished, perfect image. And for a second, he almost regretted coming. But then he caught Thomas's glance. It was a simple look, no words spoken, just an acknowledgement. Thomas didn't expect him to blend in or suddenly become a part of this life. He didn't push him to act like they were the perfect father and son. Instead, Thomas simply gave him the space to exist, to be himself, without judgment. As the evening unfolded, Elijah found himself in quiet conversations with people he would never have imagined meeting. There was something about the way Thomas introduced him, not as a guest, but as a presence, that started to shift the way Elijah saw himself. It wasn't about the high society of the event, or the elegant clothes, or the smooth interactions of those around him. It was about the small, ordinary moments that made him feel like he mattered. By the end of the night, something had changed. Elijah wasn't just Thomas's shadow anymore. He had found his own place in that world, even if it was still tentative and unsure. The barriers that had existed between them felt slightly less insurmountable. They were still walking the line between father and son, still figuring out what that relationship could look like, but at least they were walking it together. The next few months brought more challenges that tested not just their bond, but their individual growth. Elijah's life outside of their tentative relationship continued to unfold. He was still in high school, still grappling with his place in the world, trying to balance the normal teenage chaos with the complexity of discovering the truth about his father. His friends, his teachers, his world. It was all changing now that he had reconnected with Thomas. But that didn't mean it was easy. One afternoon, Elijah sat down with Thomas in the judge's office, his face unusually serious. The door to the office was closed, and for a moment, there was only the sound of Elijah's breath, heavy in the silence. "Judge," Elijah began, using the title with an air of formality that still felt strange between them. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." Thomas nodded, the weight of the moment settling over him. "Anything, Elijah? What is it?" Elijah hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Do you think you've changed? I mean, you've been doing all these things. You've been trying to be there. But do you think it's really making a difference? Are you doing it because you feel guilty, or because you want to be a part of my life? I need to know if this is real, if we are real." Thomas was taken aback by the directness of the question. He had always been a man who valued the truth, but facing it now, through Elijah's eyes, was more challenging than he could have imagined. "I can't promise you that I have it all figured out, Elijah," Thomas said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of his own uncertainty. "I'm not doing this because I feel guilty. I'm doing this because I want to get to know you. I want to understand who you are and be part of your life. I'm trying because you matter to me. You're my son, and I want to be there for you, not just because I owe you anything, but because I want to." Elijah's expression softened, the edges of doubt in his eyes beginning to fade. "I just need you to be real with me, Judge. I need to know that you're not here out of some sense of obligation. I need to know that you want to be here. That you're not just doing this because it's the right thing, but because it's what you want, too." Thomas leaned forward, locking eyes with Elijah. "I want to be here, Elijah. I want this. To be real. I've never wanted anything more in my life." The weight of his words hung in the air between them, and for the first time, Elijah smiled, a small, tentative smile, but one that carried with it the beginnings of something deeper, something more lasting. The next day, Thomas took a step that would mark another milestone in their relationship. He invited Elijah to join him for a weekend retreat, a quiet cabin by the lake, far from the distractions of the city. The retreat wasn't about solving everything or fixing the past. It was simply about spending time together, about learning to be comfortable in each other's presence without the expectations of the world pressing down on them. When they arrived, the cabin was serene, the air crisp with the scent of pine. Elijah was quiet as they unpacked, but he seemed at ease in the calm of the natural surroundings. Thomas, too, found peace in the simplicity of the moment. No judgments, no rush, just two people trying to figure out what it meant to be father and son. They spent the weekend fishing, talking, and exploring the quiet beauty of the lake. There were no heavy conversations or deep revelations, just the slow, steady rhythm of learning to coexist. Elijah found comfort in the silence, and Thomas found solace in the company. As the weekend came to a close, they sat by the lake, watching the sun set over the water, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. "I don't know what the future holds," Thomas said quietly, his voice low but filled with sincerity. "But I know that I'm here, Elijah, and I'm not going anywhere." Elijah looked at him, his eyes reflecting the fading light of the evening. For the first time, there was a sense of peace between them. They weren't father and son in the way that Thomas had once imagined. There was no perfect bond, no ideal relationship. But there was something more authentic, more grounded. And for the first time, both of them felt ready to embrace the future together, no matter where it would lead. A new legacy. As the months stretched into a year, the dynamic between Thomas and Elijah settled into a rhythm that was both comforting and unpredictable. Their relationship, though still new and fragile, had begun to find its own unique shape, defined not by grand moments of dramatic revelation, but by the quiet, steady persistence of two people learning how to bridge a vast divide. It was the slow, organic growth of trust that allowed them to truly see each other, no longer as strangers, but as father and son, in whatever form that might take. The events in the courtroom that had first brought Elijah into Thomas's life seemed like distant memories now, fading into the past, overshadowed by the reality of their new interactions. But that moment of confrontation, the burst of anger and the desperate declaration that had rattled Thomas to his core, was not lost on either of them. It had been a spark, the thing that forced both of them to confront their shared history and everything that had been left unsaid for years. In many ways, that moment marked the beginning of a healing process, a journey neither of them had been prepared for, but one that they both needed. Elijah's life was progressing in fits and starts. High school was still a challenge, especially with the lingering stigma of being the kid with an absentee father. But with Thomas's steady presence in his life, there was a newfound sense of stability. Elijah was beginning to find his own footing, learning how to balance the demands of school, relationships, and the quiet weight of his father's legacy. He had moments of doubt, moments where the old anger resurfaced, but he also had something he hadn't had before, a father who, despite his flaws, was willing to stay, to be there, to try. Thomas, too, was evolving in his own way. The man who had once seen his life in terms of victories in the courtroom, the man who had prided himself on his detachment from emotional ties, was now forced to reckon with his own vulnerabilities. He found himself taking fewer cases, opting instead to spend more time with Elijah, learning what it meant to be a parent. There were moments when he felt lost, unsure of what to do or say. But there were also moments of growth, moments when he realized that showing up was often the most important thing he could do. The courthouse, once the center of his world, had begun to feel less important. The judgments, the rulings, the cases, it all seemed distant now, trivial in comparison to the complexities of rebuilding a relationship with the son he had left behind. He was still the same judge, still the same man who had made a name for himself in the legal world, but his priorities had shifted. He had learned that there were things more important than winning a case, things like showing up for someone you love, no matter how difficult or uncertain that might be. One crisp autumn afternoon, as they sat on the porch of Thomas's home, Elijah turned to his father, a curious glint in his eye. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't left?" Elijah asked, his voice low but earnest. Thomas's gaze lingered on the horizon, the setting sun casting long shadows across the ground. It was a question that had been lingering in his own mind for months, but one he had never dared to ask himself. "I think about it all the time," Thomas admitted, his voice thick with regret. "I think about the man I could have been, the father I should have been. I think about the years I lost, and I can't help but wonder how things might have been different if I had stayed. But there's no use in wondering too much. All I can do now is be here, with you, and try to make up for what I can." Elijah nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "I used to hate you for leaving," he said, his words slow, deliberate. "I used to think I could never forgive you, but now, I think I get it. You didn't leave because you didn't care. You left because you couldn't handle it. And I get that now. It doesn't make it right, but I get it." Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat. It was a strange thing, hearing Elijah speak those words, both freeing and painful, as if some unseen weight had been lifted from his chest, while another, more subtle burden was placed there instead. His son had grown into someone who could see beyond the mistakes of the past, someone who was willing to let go of the anger that had once defined him. In that moment, Thomas realized just how far Elijah had come, and just how far they both had come. "You're right," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't handle it. But I want you to know that I never stopped caring. I just didn't know how to fix everything. And maybe I still don't, but I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Elijah didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out at the view, his eyes distant, as if pondering the magnitude of his father's words. After a long silence, he turned back to Thomas, his expression softened by a quiet understanding. "I'm not asking you to fix everything," Elijah said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm just asking you to be real with me. That's all. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to be here. That's what matters." Thomas felt a deep sense of relief at Elijah's words, as if some unspoken tension had finally been resolved. For the first time, he realized that he didn't have to be perfect. He didn't have to be the ideal father he had once imagined. All he had to do was be present, to show up and be himself, flaws and all. That evening, as they shared a quiet dinner together, Thomas looked at Elijah and saw the young man he had become, a person capable of forgiveness, of understanding, and of seeing beyond the mistakes of the past. And in that moment, Thomas knew that while the past could never be erased, the future held something far more precious, a chance to create a new legacy. Elijah, for his part, had come to terms with his own feelings. The anger, the confusion, the resentment, it was all still there, buried somewhere beneath the surface. But he had learned to let go of it, to accept that some things couldn't be fixed in an instant. He had learned that love wasn't always about perfection. Sometimes it was about finding the courage to keep trying, even when the road was difficult, even when the wounds ran deep. As they sat together, the quiet hum of the evening settling around them, Thomas realized something else, something that had eluded him for so long. Fatherhood wasn't a destination. It wasn't about reaching some idealized version of what a father and son should be. It was about the journey, about the small, everyday moments of connection that slowly built something stronger than either of them could have imagined. He looked at Elijah, this young man who had once stood in his courtroom with anger in his eyes, and he saw something different now. He saw a person who was learning to trust, to forgive, to love without expectation. And in that moment, Thomas understood what it meant to be a father, to be the one who stayed, who showed up, who was there when it mattered most. The road ahead was still uncertain, still filled with challenges and obstacles. But for the first time in a long time, Thomas felt ready, ready to face whatever came next, ready to build a future not based on the mistakes of the past, but on the hope of what they could become. Together.